Mornings in Willowbend have a quiet beauty that feels almost sacred. Mist drifts between tall pine trees, and the fresh scent of damp earth and wild thyme hangs in the air. I had been living in a rustic cabin near the edge of the valley, where silence was a constant presence in my life. That changed one fateful morning when I discovered a tiny orange kitten curled up under my old woodshed, its frail body shaking. Above, perched on the decaying roof, was a wild falcon. She wasn't merely watching the kitten, she was fiercely protecting it. As I moved closer, my boots crunched on the frosty grass, and I raised my hands, almost as if preparing to defuse a tense situation. The kitten let out a weak cry, barely louder than the gentle breeze, but my attention was drawn to the falcon. She remained completely still, wings slightly open and talons gripping the roof's edge, following my every move. I had seen various birds of prey before, hawks, eagles, and the occasional owl, yet this one felt different. Her gaze was intense and watchful, as though she had claimed the kitten and wanted me to know it. When I knelt down, the falcon let out an alarmingly sharp cry that pierced through the morning calm. I froze in place. In a flash, she dove toward me, her wings cutting through the air before she swept back up, only inches from my head. It was a clear warning, one I understood immediately. With my heart racing, I stepped back. What was unfolding before me? For the next hour, I observed from a distance, crouched behind the woodshed, my breath forming clouds in the cool air. The falcon, whom I would later name Rook, hopped down to the kitten and gently nudged it with her beak. She appeared to bring bits of raw meat, likely taken from a hapless squirrel, and made sure they were placed right at the kitten's feet. But the little one didn't eat. Instead, he looked at her with wide eyes, as if she were the only steady thing in his confused little world. At that moment, I realized this was more than just a random occurrence. It was the start of a bond, with its own unspoken rules. For the next 2 days, I observed them like an outsider in my own yard. I left food and water just a few feet from the woodshed, but Rook always positioned herself to prevent me from getting any closer than 10 yards. Whenever I crossed that invisible boundary, she took to the sky, screaming fiercely, her wings spread wide. It was a clear message: back off. She had taken on the role of caregiver for the kitten, acting as its mother, protector, and even a kind of personal bodyguard. By the third morning, I had started calling the kitten Noodle. He was now wobbling around on his tiny, unsteady legs. Strangely, he only ate the food that Rook brought him and ignored what I offered. This puzzled me. A falcon shouldn't behave like this, and a kitten shouldn't have survived in the cold for days without proper care. Yet somehow, they were managing to support each other. Then Mara arrived. It was great to see her, as she ran the local wildlife rehab center. With her blend of scientific knowledge and instinct, she was sharp with animals, yet blunt with people. "You need to step in," she said, placing her hands on her hips and surveying the yard. "This isn't normal. That falcon isn't acting right. It could be illness, injury, or perhaps she lost a chick." I was at a loss for words. All I knew was that if I reached for Noodle, Rook would lash out. A part of me surprisingly respected that instinct. There was a unique bond between them, and I hesitated to disrupt it simply because I couldn't fully grasp what was happening. By the 5th morning, the ground near the woodshed revealed a troubling scene. The frost was disturbed, marked by streaks where something had moved awkwardly, hairs dragging or limping, leaving thin ribbons of dark blood that sparkled faintly in the morning sunlight. A cold feeling, unrelated to the mountain air, crept down my spine as I approached, my eyes searching the area until they settled on a small, curled-up figure by the shed. Noodle was tightly tucked in, his little body shivering unpredictably, and his tail flicked restlessly, signaling that something had changed. But it wasn't Noodle that left me frozen in place. It was the eerie silence above. Rook wasn't on the roof anymore. Instead, she was perched lower, on a fence post, her wings slightly spread and feathers fluffed in disarray. Her eyes, half closed in fatigue, hinted at something wrong. As I moved closer, I noticed it, a jagged wound beneath her wing, dried blood matted around the injury, and inflamed tissue pulsing faintly beneath her trembling form. The wound wasn't fresh. The edges suggested it had occurred days ago, perhaps around the time she first appeared. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. She hadn't come to care for the kitten simply out of instinct or a sudden impulse of nature. She had been left alone, too hurt to move and too proud to ask for help. In the midst of her pain, she found Noodle, a small, vulnerable creature, just as lost as she was. I didn't hesitate to call Mara. She arrived quickly, her concern evident but controlled. As she stepped into the clearing, Rook the falcon lifted into the air with a sharp cry. It wasn't as fierce as before, but it still held a strong protective instinct that surprised Mara. Below, Noodle arched his back, his wide eyes reflecting a fierce spirit uncommon for such a young kitten. A thin hiss escaped him, defensive yet fragile. Mara turned to me, a hint of disbelief softening her features. "They've imprinted," she said quietly, "on each other." Her words hung in the air, heavy and quiet. I didn't respond right away, just stood there observing the two of them. Two scarred souls linked by experiences beyond our understanding. It was clear that whatever was happening between them couldn't be easily unraveled without causing harm. Mara moved slowly around the clearing, arms crossed, deep in thought as she examined the falcon from all angles. She had dealt with many animals before, like owls that had become accustomed to the noise of traffic and hawks that mourned lost nests. But this connection between predator and prey was something else entirely. It felt unnatural, yet also strangely right. Rook stood guard with her wings slightly raised, trembling with every breath, while Noodle curled close, not quite touching but always near, living in her shadow. The space between them buzzed with an unspoken bond. Theo, who had ventured up from the city a couple of days earlier to see how I was faring in my secluded lifestyle, leaned against the porch rail, mug in hand. He looked skeptical. "You can't be serious," he said, glancing at Noodle. "It's a falcon. It eats things like him." He sipped his coffee, as if that settled the matter, his orderly view of the world unable to accommodate this unexpected pairing. I stayed quiet. I didn't have answers, just instincts urging me to watch, to give them both the space they needed to navigate this unusual relationship. Each time I approached, Rook's warning call rang out, quieter now, like a worn-out cloth. She was weary. They both were. Yet they held on to each other, perhaps clinging to the fragile hope that the world wouldn't intrude just yet. That week brought a sharp change in the weather. Nights grew frigid, and the wind from the ridgelines blew in uninvited, whistling through the pines and rattling the loose shingles on the cabin. I set up a tarp by the shed, leaning it against bales of hay and filling it with blankets, hoping Rook and Noodle might find some warmth. But they didn't. Rook stood her ground, facing the cold, her feathers puffed up against the biting wind as if challenging the mountain. Noodle stayed close, tucked under a warped plank of the shed, his eyes blinking slowly in the frosty light. I realized this situation couldn't last. Nature rarely makes exceptions, not for feelings and certainly not for miracles. Then the letter arrived. A neighbor from down the trail, Miss Cartwright, who believed wildlife management meant using a shotgun and voicing strong opinions, had seen Rook limping and acting unusual. She reported it to the local game warden. Mara found out first, arriving at my cabin with her truck door slamming shut, an urgent tone in her voice. "They're thinking about removing her. They might trap her, relocate her, or worse if they think she poses a threat." That thought felt like a blow. Rook had become more than just another bird in my eyes, and Noodle, still too weak to care for himself, would be left alone without his protector. In that moment, my focus shifted from how to help them to how to keep them safe, from everything else. I found myself sitting on the porch late into the night, my fingers wrapped around a cold mug of tea, eyes fixed on the shed fading into the darkness. Out there, beneath the whispers of the wind and the creaks of the trees, Rook rested with her wings tucked in, as if they were broken armor. Noodle's faint meows drifted in and out, quiet as a whisper, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. I couldn't shake the thought of the fine line we were all walking, between rescue and interference, between love and control. Was my desire to help truly for them, or was it more for me? Hours earlier, Mara had left, caught between her professional responsibilities and the instinct that this situation was different. "You could bring them in," she said, her voice careful and low. "We could take care of Rook properly." Noodle had potential for foster care, or perhaps even adoption. However, their current situation wasn't sustainable. The thought weighed heavily on me. If I took them in, I might disrupt something precious, but if I didn't, I risked losing them both to the cold, predators, or the harshness of human decisions. It was no longer simply about survival. It was about what survival truly meant, who it benefited, and at what cost. The day after the frost melted, I discovered the shed was empty. The nest of hay remained undisturbed, and the old plank where Noodle usually rested still felt warm to my touch. Yet the space beneath it was empty. No falcon, no kitten, just a heavy silence that hung like a taut wire between the trees. I called out their names softly, barely a whisper, hoping to hear a response, but the forest remained silent. It felt as though something had erased them completely. For hours, I searched the area, my boots sinking into the still frozen ground, my heart racing in my chest, as if it didn't remember how to keep calm. Every rustle in the underbrush and every creaking branch made me flinch. There were no signs of struggle, no feathers, no tracks. They had disappeared, as if their connection had simply walked into the woods. Just before dusk, I found some clues. A series of thin gouges on the bark of a cedar tree, high up, not quite at the height a falcon would reach, but certainly too high for a cat. These claw marks were deep and purposeful. Nearby, I spotted a round paw print pressed in the mud. This wasn't their mark. A predator had come through, perhaps a cougar or something even more dangerous. The thought hit me hard. Had Rook attempted to take Noodle to a safer place? Were they chased? Were they still alive? Our fragile sense of calm shattered at that moment. The balance of nature had shifted, and it felt like we were running out of time to make things right. That night, sleep eluded me. The forest felt heavy, enveloped in a silence that was far from peaceful. It felt like the trees were watching closely. I sat on the porch, flashlight in hand, my old flannel wrapped around my shoulders, my gaze fixed on the tree line. Around midnight, I thought I heard a sound, softer than a raccoon, heavier than a squirrel. But when I stepped off the porch, everything fell silent again. My heart ached in a way that felt familiar, when you've become attached to something delicate and suddenly question whether it's still there. As morning broke over the ridge, Mara returned, her boots heavy with mud and her eyes showing the wear of a long night. Without saying a word, she handed me a thermos of coffee and stared blankly toward the shed. Then, almost out of the blue, she asked, "If we find them, would you keep him? Noodle?" Her soft voice felt impactful, forcing me to think about a decision I had avoided. Bringing him into my life meant taking on responsibility and the possibility of heartache, all wrapped up in a small orange bundle of energy. Before I could gather my thoughts, Theo emerged from the cabin, his voice quieter than usual. "There's something near the creek," he said, pointing with a pale hand. We moved in silence, our boots squelching in the muddy ground. And then, beneath a rocky overhang just above the creek bed, we spotted them. Rook sat on a low branch, her eyes dull yet still fierce, while Noodle curled up at the base of a tree root, looking up at us with a mix of confusion and trust. In that moment, something changed. It wasn't relief or triumph, rather a quiet realization that we were already more connected than we had realized. We lingered by the creek, time seemingly standing still as we watched. Soft golden light filtered through the trees, illuminating the mist rising off the water. It was as if the world paused, capturing a moment that felt significant. Rook held her wings slightly raised, indicating her discomfort without being overtly threatening. I noticed the wound under her wing had worsened. Raw and swollen, it seemed to need urgent care. Without help, she wouldn't heal, and Noodle wouldn't make it either. Mara crouched down slowly, trying not to disturb the stillness. "We don't have much time," she said quietly. "If we don't get her medical help, she'll die. Maybe not today, but soon." Theo shifted uneasily beside me. "What if we take her in? Will she survive in captivity? Can she ever be released again?" His voice didn't carry any anger, just a weighed-down sincerity. "And what about him?" he added, nodding toward Noodle. "He's formed a bond with a bird that's not meant to care for him. What happens if that bond is broken?" There were no easy answers. Every path we considered felt like it came at a cost. I looked at them, this unusual family of feathers, fur, and silent need, and felt the weight of my decision resting heavily on my shoulders. I had hoped nature would find a way to sort everything out on its own, But now it seemed clear that nature was calling for our help. We faced a choice. Stepping in could mean saving them, but it also risked unraveling the fragile connection that had kept them alive so far. As we returned to the cabin, the atmosphere between us felt charged with all the things we hadn't said aloud. Rook was still too weak to fly, and Noodle, sensing her friend's vulnerability, wouldn't stray from her side. Mara had contacted someone from the wildlife center, a specialist who could come with a mobile unit, but they wouldn't be there until the next morning. We had just one night to figure out what to do next. Mara stood by the window, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the silhouettes of Rook and Noodle, sheltered beneath the tarp we had rigged up again. We could sedate her, just enough to treat the wound, then we could bring her back here and let her go once she's strong again. No cages, no rehabilitation. Her voice was calm, but I could sense the uncertainty lurking beneath. But what if something goes wrong? What if she doesn't wake up? Noodle won't understand that. Theo was sitting at the kitchen table, idly spinning a spoon in his hands. You can't keep them together forever. Do you really think this falcon's gonna stick around and raise a cat? Come on, man. This isn't a fairy tale. I took a moment before responding. A part of me recognized that he was right, but another part, the one that had witnessed their unique bond form, that had seen the gentleness in Rook's movements, and the way Noodle nestled into her feathers as if he had known her forever, wasn't ready to break them apart simply because it seemed illogical to keep them together. That night, as the temperature dropped and the wind rattled the cabin walls, I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat by the door, listening to their soft breathing in the darkness. Did I really have the right to decide their fate? Yet deep down, I knew that I would have to make a choice. Dawn arrived slowly and coldly, with pale light seeping between the tree branches, almost as if it were hesitant to disturb what lay below. I was already awake, bundled in my jacket and seated on the porch steps, my eyes fixed on the clearing where Rook and Noodle huddled together. Sleep had eluded me, and I wasn't alone. None of us had rested well. The night felt sacred and delicate, each passing hour heavy with the unspoken truth that today, something significant would change. The wildlife team was on the way, and Mara confirmed it with a soft voice over the phone. They would bring the supplies we needed to safely sedate Rook, allowing us to clean and stitch up her wound and possibly start her on antibiotics. Along with that, they were also bringing all the necessary equipment: capture crates, transport gear, and paperwork. This was the routine of turning wild animals into patients, transforming them into a series of numbers. Theo stood nearby, arms crossed and watchful. Despite his usual skepticism, I could see the concern etched in the tense line of his jaw. He had fallen quiet, no longer probing with logic. It seemed even he recognized the bond between the falcon and the kitten was beyond mere reasoning. Mara, who usually had a clear sense of direction, was now thoughtful and reserved. She crouched beside me and spoke without looking directly at Rook. If she panics or lashes out, we could lose her. Maybe both of them. You understand that, right? I nodded slowly, my throat feeling tight with emotion. We were standing on the brink of a decision, between what was right and what was humane, between letting go and holding on. In that stillness, a question loomed. Were we truly saving them, or were we interfering in a way we shouldn't have? A gust of wind blew through, and the sound of tires crunching on the gravel road broke the silence. The moment had arrived. The van pulled up quietly, its tires parting the frost-damp earth with ease. A woman stepped out first. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, her face weathered by the sun, and her eyes seemed as steady as river stones. Calm and composed, she introduced herself as Celia, the falcon specialist. Without hesitation, she started prepping the sedative, her hands moving with the assuredness of someone very experienced in this work. However, as she listened to Mara describe the unique connection between the bird and the kitten, I noticed her brow furrowing slightly, a tiny crack in her usual neutrality. "I've never encountered something like this," she said quietly, glancing toward the tarp where Rook perched, her feathers fluffed defensively while Noodle pressed close to her side like a steady heartbeat. "We need to proceed with caution." Everything seemed to happen slowly yet quickly all at once. Together we moved forward, Celia, Mara, and I, taking careful steps through the clearing, our breaths held in the quiet. This time, Rook didn't call out. She simply watched us. Her eyes, weary but alert, held a flicker of warning. Yet she didn't try to flee. Maybe she understood. Maybe she had already made a choice. Just as Celia lifted the dart gun, Noodle did something surprising. He stepped directly in front of her. His small, trembling form stood between us and the falcon like a protective barrier. There was no hiss, no sound, just a clear sense of defiance. In that fleeting moment, Celia gently lowered her weapon. "We can't," she murmured. "Not like this." A heavy silence settled over us, thick and weighty. The decision we faced hung suspended in the air. At that moment, I realized we wouldn't take her. Not today. Perhaps not ever. Instead, we took a step back, slowly and carefully. For the first time since Rook entered my life, she shut her eyes, not in slumber, but as an act of trust. Whatever lay ahead, it would unfold on their terms. Weeks have rolled by since that morning by the creek, and they're still around. Not every day, and not always together, but enough to show that their bond remains strong. Rook no longer sits on the roof as a guard. Now she comes and goes, more robust than before, her flight steady and her wound healed not just by time, but by her growing independence. She hunts in the early morning light and returns at dusk, her wings gliding just above the treetops, always circling once before landing near the woodshed. Noodle, now a bit rounder and bolder, follows her like a furry shadow, still too small to hunt, yet too wild to be held. Mara comes by less often. Theo has returned to the city, quieter than when he first arrived, but I can see the change in both of them. Something softened, something shifted. There are fewer disagreements about what we should have done and more quiet moments as we reflect on what actually happened. We didn't save Rook and Noodle. They saved each other. And perhaps in a small way, they saved something in us too. I'm unsure how long this will continue. Perhaps one day Rook won't come back. Maybe Noodle will choose a different path, embracing a wilder life. But that's the nature of rescue, isn't it? It's rarely straightforward. It's messy and delicate, filled with tough choices and moments that blur the lines, and yet it holds significance. Because occasionally, nature writes its own narrative. All we can do is listen. If this story resonated with you, if Rook and Noodle sparked something gentle in your heart, think about sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of unexpected bonds, second chances, or the simple strength found in letting things be. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to read more stories like this, ones that bridge the gap between the wild and the human, where nothing is ever truly simple, yet everything is profoundly felt. What would you do in this situation? Often, the toughest decision isn't about saving someone. It's about having faith in their ability to stand on their own. Trusting others can be challenging, especially when we care deeply for them. It's natural to want to jump in and help, but sometimes the most supportive action is to step back and let them find their own way. Have you ever faced a moment like that? Reflecting on those times can help us understand the importance of trust in our relationships.